Well, welcome everyone. This is to this edition of Coffee with Joe. I'm Joe Osamendi, your host on RVN TV. But again, that's not the most important thing. If you know that you've watched the show, the most important thing is the gentleman I have sitting right next to me, because you're going to meet Josh Peskin today, and he's going to talk about a lot of great things about consulting. Josh, welcome to Coffee with Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Now, you know, we and I talked before, and there's a couple of things that I think were very interesting. You're kind of a different consultant than your competitors. Give me your philosophy into consulting and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I started in the consulting world, I guess, about 10 years ago, 11, 12 years ago. And I got into it not in a typical route. I got a doctorate first at Stanford. And I was not a typical hire for a consulting firm, but I sort of presented my degree as a cross-cultural communications degree. And I got hired by a firm out in Berlin. And so I think I've always had a lot of people get into consulting, they do it in their 20s, or they spend a career, and then they decide to go basically show people what they learned in their career. But I have kind of had this, or at least developed a more holistic approach over the years, which kind of combines my academic work, consulting experience, and then also extensive time in-house in organizations. So I would say, in a nutshell, the evolution of my career and how I now approach a project is much less about creating some small deliverable or some big deliverable like a report, and much more about really engaging with leadership and getting a sense of the sort of holistic diagnosis of an organization, and all the way down to its philosophy and its approach to what it's trying to do in the world. And then I also I hang in there. I try to hang in through execution, which is something that's also not very typical.
One of the things that I was very interested in what you said is because anybody can do management consulting. I shouldn't say anybody, but anybody with credentials can do it. But I think what sets you apart is you're also interested in the implementation, because the implementation of a program is just as important as the idea.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's what got me into it in the first place. So I was feeling very ivory tower and not out there in the world doing stuff. And so my interest in getting into consulting in the first place was really to get into organizations, understand what's going on, understand where they may not be applying the same sort of sophistication or subtlety of thought that they are applying elsewhere, and to find those areas and try to help build them out, and to see what happens. See, you know, if you just write a report, it goes up on the wall.
Right.
You know, it's more of a business model for consulting firms, where they can have a senior person come in, bring in business, and then a junior person does some deliverables, creates a report, it goes on the shelf, and then they call it done and move on.
Right.
But for me, what's interesting is the sort of iterative process of, okay, you have your report, your recommendations, now you're trying to implement, and now you move into more of a design phase of trying things and tweaking things and working with leadership, because there's an incredible number of things that keep what sound like very simple and important advice from actually happening. And you have to sort of ferret all that out. But, you know, problems with the board and leadership, problems with staff that have been there for a long time that don't want to implement change. There's all kinds of different risks associated with it, and difficulties in the implementation, and that's what I find most fascinating, actually.
Would you consider yourself a strategic consultant, strategic communications consultant? Would that be a good description of you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I would say I focus on three areas. Strategic communications is really the space I grew out of, so building strategic communications plans, crisis communications, PR, marketing, that kind of thing, and then I sort of, you know, in approaching this more holistic thinking, started to bring in other aspects of the organizations that were intimately tied with it to a sort of what I would call an overall strategy so I would say three areas: overall strategy, specifically strategic communications, and then also fundraising with nonprofits.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little later, because I'm very interested in talking about nonprofits, and somebody that was on my show before, which I'm going to share some of his ideas with you. You know, you also teach at university, don't you?
I do. I teach at Drexel University.
Okay, what do you do there?
So I teach with the Honors College, and I also am what I would call a consultant with them. They're not, I mean, they are structured to have consultants, but I think my role there, since I'm also faculty, is, well, my role is a consulting role to help develop a new program that they're building out. So I kind of wear two hats at Drexel.
Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is that's kind of a different role. I've never heard of that before. Is that something new that Drexel just basically has developed themselves?
The building a new program.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I think that has to do with my what I'm doing. You know, I teach for their honors college,
Right.
and I teach
Okay.
classes, and I think my original connection with Drexel was actually both at once. It was talking with the dean of their honors college
Okay.
about an initiative she was interested in, at the same time as talking with her about starting to teach for the honors college. So I guess they both kind of grew out organically at the same time, and it just happened to become both a consulting engagement and a teaching engagement.
And they had the right guy at the right time.
Yeah,
Right?
well, I think so.
That's what happened. You know, you've seen probably a lot of changes in the world of consulting. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The world of consulting is enormous, and so I suppose you could talk about some of the big firms and kind of how they've evolved over the last 20 years. But I can't look at the evolution of consulting firms without seeing my own evolution. So in my own thinking, the first firm I worked at was in '08. It wasn't my first project, but it was the first firm I worked at, and I was introduced to, I think, a very typical consulting model, which is you have junior and senior folks. You have hunters and skinners, as they're called, and you know, the senior folks go out and get the business, the junior people, and then it's a sort of financial structure of the more you have junior people working on a piece of business, the more profitable it is for the organization. So there's a natural tendency to move in that direction.
Okay.
And what I have personally noticed is that leads to focusing on deliverables and focusing on sort of concrete moments in an engagement, which mostly serve the consulting firm to be able to kind of cover their backsides and say, okay, look, this is what we promised, this is what we supplied, and here's our bill. And so I think how it's evolved for me, and I also see it out there in the world, is to really add value, you have to understand on a deeper level what's going on, and your projects, I think, also have to have a more holistic understanding of the other pieces of organizations.
Okay.
And I think if you come in with your cookie cutter and you say, okay, this is a perfect size for my cookie cutter, it's kind of like how they say, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right, right.
So that works for the hammer, but it doesn't work for the rest of the world. So in my own opinion, I have really grown, and through applying my academic work, applying my experience in-house in organizations, and applying my consulting experience to get a more three-dimensional approach is how I would describe it. And I think that's been my evolution, and a lot of the great consultants out there, that's what I see as evolution in the field of consulting.
Okay. Now, the pandemic obviously affected everybody in a lot of different ways. How do you feel consulting as a whole being affected by the pandemic?
Well, it's tough to speak for consulting as a whole, because I think some folks have closed up shop,
Right.
some folks have held on, and some folks have actually grown during this period.
Okay.
I'm lucky that I'm one of the ones who's grown, and I think some of that's right place, right time, and I think also. I mean, there's also some structural stuff, because there are layoffs happening, and
Right.
a lot of times people may still have some money in their budget that hasn't been rated by the finance officer,
Okay.
But they had to drop people. So if there's some situations where they have more work than they can do, and they can hire a consultant to come in and help with things that normally they would have had staff for, but now they don't have the staff, so they can. But that's fairly rare, because a lot of times if you're making budgetary cuts to lose staff, you're also losing your consulting budget or whatever other budget you'd pull it from. It's hard to speak for the industry as a whole, because it's such a mammoth industry. I mean, you could even subdivide consulting into probably endless subdivisions, but let's
Sure.
just say a dozen big subdivisions. Strategic communications is its own world. Management consulting is its own world. Some of the change implementation, organizational change and behavior and development. So there's a bunch of different ways you could parse it, and you'd probably have to look at each one to see
Okay.
how COVID's impacted it. But my own personal experience has been I've been very lucky. Knock wood, thank you, that it's worked out. But I know that it's been very difficult out there.
But one thing that's very interesting about what you've done is you've seen COVID as an opportunity rather than an impediment.
Yeah, well, I sort of approached it with a sense that there was going to be a lot of opportunity. A lot of times when you have shakeups like this, it's very disruptive to organizations. It's very stressful, and certain things have to get done. So there are decisions made to lose staff or to try to trim budget in different places, and then leadership will sort of realize, wait a second, we were in the middle of implementing some new strategic plan or some new initiative, and if we don't make headway during this period of time, then we're gonna be worse off than if we try. Finding money to do this is going to be smarter than just constricting, which might force further constricting.
Okay. Now take me through if I was going to hire you, how would we start out? Take me through that kind of process.
Well, so first off, are you a for-profit or are you a nonprofit?
Well, we'll talk about nonprofits later. So let's talk about for-profits.
Okay, you're
now.
a for-profit. Are you a startup or have you been around for a while?
Let's say I'm a startup.
Okay. Do you have an idea, or are you you don't care what the idea is, you're a manager or you're a structural person? Which kind of person are you?
My person is, I have an idea. I don't exactly know how to put this in a structure-wise so I can maximize my profits and control my organization and make sure that I'm making my people not my problem but my solution.
Okay.
So how would you do that?
So I actually have a client that is a great parallel to this. It's a startup called Bonfire Digital Wellness, and I am functioning as their chief strategy officer. That's my title. And this is a case where there was a CEO who had an idea and started talking with people about his idea. He also had funding, and started to kind of flesh out an idea around basically educating kids. So if you look at the statistics around tech use and screen use in kids, so first off, look at it in adults. It's scary. But if you look at it in kids, and they don't have the same coping mechanisms, they don't have the same discipline, able to sort of force themselves to put down a screen or to why something's bad for them. And so he had this idea it sort of evolved over time, but it became an idea to develop both an app and in-person coaching over Zoom to offer a coaching apparatus for kids to help them learn about how to be online, how to do it in a healthy way. Because I mean, we don't have to get into it here, but there's so many pitfalls from cyberbullying to just outright danger to addiction to screens and video games, things like that. There's pornography. I mean, there's just a million things where kids can go wrong online. So this coaching company would basically once a week work with kids to help them understand what healthy limits are. And interestingly, it focuses on a lot of core issues like exercise, food, sleep, and then also tech use.
Okay. So
this is his idea. And he comes to me and he says, I have this idea. I want to start making a company. So that's a case where we did a visioning session. We did a strategic planning session. What's our mission, vision, values? What are we trying to create? What does success look like? Let's start putting some of this stuff on a timeline to figure out, okay, if we want to have a go-live date that's 1 year out, and we want to do a soft launch that's 9 months out, and we want to be doing some beta testing that's 6 months out. Now it ended up the timeline's bigger than that. But
Right.
but just for the sake of conversation, then okay, that means you need to get to beta testing by 6 months. So then you can kind of work backwards to figure out what has to happen in month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, et cetera, in order to get you there. So then my role becomes trying to spot risk at every turn. It becomes trying to sort of lay the track for how do we cover this distance? What are all the way down to the concrete action steps that everyone has to take? How do we staff up? What's our funding? How do we incorporate legal, HR, et cetera? So that would be the way you would, standing on one foot, that sort of might look like the structure to how you would start, how I would help somebody who has a startup idea get to a go-live date.
Okay, great. No, we're going to take a break right now, but we're going to right back with Josh Peskin and talk about nonprofits when we come back. Stick around.
All right.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
Well, welcome back again to Coffee with Joe. I'm Joe Osamendi, your host, but again, that's not the most important thing, as I usually say, because the most important thing is Josh Peskin, the guy that's sitting right next to me, because Josh has a lot to talk about strategic consulting, about consulting in general. And welcome again to the program. Really appreciate you having here.
It's great to be here.
Good. No, we left about looking at a startup and stuff and how an engagement would work, but I want to talk about nonprofits for a minute. Because I have a person I've been on my show that basically, his name is Jimmy LaRose, and he's got a very unique approach to nonprofits. His idea is that nonprofits can actually learn from the for-profit organizations to be more effective at what they do. And I know that you're involved in fundraising for nonprofits too, right? Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell me your approach to working in nonprofits?
Yeah, so I have done quite a bit of work in the nonprofit sector, and in all three of those areas I described, in communications, fundraising, and what I would call overall strategy and direction and leadership coaching, et cetera. And yeah, I would agree 100%. I mean, I would guess what your friend Jimmy LaRose is meaning by that is to be more professional, do things better, and have, I guess, more fiscal responsibility, and maybe even also focusing on revenue streams and things like that, so that you're optimizing those things. And yeah, I would agree, and I would say that has been a sort of guiding light of my consulting with nonprofit organizations. Is a lot of times people get involved with nonprofit organizations because they love the cause.
Right.
They feel really passionate about it, and it might not actually even occur to, say, an executive director or a CEO that getting really sophisticated around something like communications is that important. So a lot of times coming in and saying, well, all that really means is doing communications in a more subtle and thoughtful way, and it will actually help you achieve your mission more effectively. So I think in that sense, I would agree 100%. I'd have to talk. I'm really curious. Like, sort of, you could say that and mean it in several different ways. So
Right.
I'd be very curious to sort of hear more about what exactly he means with that.
Well, good. I'm going to get you in touch with him too,
Okay.
because I think your approach is, after talking to him, is very interesting, because I don't think that's the norm for dealing with nonprofits. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of consultants will come into nonprofits with that intention, and whether or not they're able to execute, or whether or not they're sort of approaching it with the same level of sophistication as they would have to if they were brought into a for-profit
Right.
organization.
Sure.
That all, I think, would be we'd have to know sort of what exactly. But I think their goal, I think most every consultant's goal going into a nonprofit organization is trying to build the capacity of the organization to deal with what they're trying to accomplish in a more sophisticated, more clear, more articulate way.
Okay. Has your approach been well received by nonprofits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really helps to have cut my teeth in the for-profit world
Okay.
with two firms, and I think it brings a level of sophistication, and there's just a certain competition that exists in the for-profit consulting space that just is not as stiff in the nonprofit consulting space, partly because there's more money in the for-profit consulting space.
Sure.
But there are a lot of consultants like me that really are interested in working with nonprofits and trying to help nonprofits. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where the most bang for the buck is, because you can come in and have what I call a tactical communications department, for example, where they're doing a newsletter, they have a website, maybe they have some social media, but they're not really approaching it from a strategic standpoint of what are our communications goals around all these properties or all these platforms.
Okay.
And sometimes it's really as simple as that. What are we actually trying to accomplish with our Twitter feed? Or what exactly are we trying to accomplish with our newsletter? And a little more clarity on that you want people to take a certain action. You want them to believe something about you, or you want them to think a certain thought. You want them to, there's a lot of different kinds of goals that are associated with communications efforts.
Okay.
So, and this is just one narrow space. It's true all across the board that every area, particularly the business areas, setting the programmatic areas aside, making the fundraising effort more, as your friend would say, business-like,
Right.
so that you are, tracking things more carefully. You know exactly where your revenue is coming from. You know exactly where you are likely to increase your revenue, i.e. donations or sponsorships or whatever, however your revenue is structured. Just digging into that and trying to build a more subtle apparatus to do these things. A lot of times nonprofits just are not, they're so run ragged that they just don't have the time or energy or wherewithal to try to continue to evolve these things that they don't necessarily see as core to their business, or
Right.
they don't see core to their organization. They see their program. We go out and we feed kids.
Right.
That's what we do.
Right.
So talking about communications and strategies around our Facebook, sometimes it just sort of, doesn't really have a ring to them. It doesn't really sing to them why you would do that.
Okay.
And same thing with their fundraising. Although, once you show them results and you show them, hey, if you were to make this fairly small adjustment, you would see a very significant response or result. That's why I love it, because you can come in and make real change. And honestly, a lot of times it doesn't even take that long.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great. When you work people with an organization, nonprofit, profit, whatever, the point is when they thank you for something, what do you expect to hear from that would make you feel really good?
When I work with a nonprofit and they're thankful for something I did,
What would you think?
well,
What would their thank you to you make you really happy that you've done something? That's what I'm trying to ask you.
yeah, well, I find it incredibly rewarding working with nonprofits. So I've worked with a huge range, and to me, there's something about helping an organization whose sole existence is to make the world a better place.
Okay.
That's rewarding. That itself feels good to me.
Good.
It feels good to me to go help the Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation and all of its, all of the free libraries around the city to help them raise more money or to help them succeed. The pats on the back. It's a business relationship too. So I don't really, I appreciate the fact that they want to hire me and that we have an engagement. And, I appreciate all that, but I think the thing I really appreciate about the engagement, and I love it when people say we're really excited about this, we're in a better spot than we were in before, this is amazing. That feels great, that feels amazing. And I think just having a significant chunk of my plate or my, my sort of consulting base always deployed towards nonprofits, there's something also satisfying just about that, even without the thank yous.
That's good. What would you say is the one thing that differentiates you from people of your competitors, people in the same kind of business?
Well, I would say probably the key thing is that I have a whole academic life going on too, which I think for me is necessary from a sort of designing my own ability to be effective. So I think, reading and teaching and hearing things percolate with students, and sometimes they have nothing to do with any sometimes they're very directly related to projects I'm working on, and sometimes they're very much not.
Okay.
And I think that keeps ideas fresh. I think that is something that I bring that most people don't bring. If they do teach, they just teach a class that's specifically related to their talent, and and it's fairly narrow. But it's not sort of organically creating new ideas and challenging ways of thinking and things like that. So I would say that has really been a boost for me, both professionally in terms of the credential, but more importantly, to just have this other space where I can kind of have as like a workshop for ideas and thinking and test ideas out and all of that kind of thing. I think it's something that even if you've spent 30 years in leadership in an organization and another 30 years consulting, you still, even after all that, could very easily have a very narrow way of thinking about things. But I think having this life in the university as well as, and Drexel's just a wonderful place to be, and combined with the time spent inside of organizations in leadership and the consulting efforts, I think that it just, creates a kind of three-dimensionality that I can bring into an organization that's a little bit different than my competitors.
Good. Now, we're at the part of a program right now, Josh, where I want you to look in that camera right there and tell people how they can reach you and who should call you. Okay, great. So we're currently in conversation of a partnership that's approached our firm. So I'm going to give you my personal email that I would hope that for you to reach out to me at, and it's peskinjosh@gmail.com. And if you reach out to me, I will absolutely keep you updated on our new website and send you a business card and also the new name of the organization. But that will always reach me no matter what happens and no matter which way I turn. I'll keep my Gmail. So peskinjosh@gmail.com. Thank you. Josh Peskin, it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, anybody out there that if you're a nonprofit or a profit and you want a great approach from not only an academic but a personal and professional relationship, Josh, you're the guy to call.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And thanks again for being on Coffee with Joe. We'll see you next week on Thursday, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.